Oh, well, I think that's close enough. We'll get underway. So this is day 4 of Stream 9, where we have the Stratum management team here. Mr. Lewandowski, do you want to sort of take us through how you propose to address this operation?
Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you. I have Mr. Stewart with me online and Mr. Clark with me in person. I thought I'd just take a few minutes to set the table, as it were, on a couple of things before handing over to Mr. Stewart. Firstly, Mr. Clark thereafter, and I might wrap up with a point I'd like to discuss around the rule and the policy as to an assessment for a resource consent, but I think I'll save that for the end.
Yep, that's fine.
Firstly, just in terms of scope, to be clear, the Stratum submission addressed these bicycle parking requirements as they applied to the centres zones collectively, but through evidence, the focus really has been on the city centre zone specifically, and so that continues to be the focus for us today.
Before you go on, can I ask you a leading question? How did you interpret table 7 of the transport chapter?
With difficulty, sir, but the flow that
where do you think it bites, so to speak?
So the logical flow there, as I understand it, or as I interpret it, is that rule TR1 takes the traditional approach that I think you were discussing on Tuesday of having the zone column there, and that applies to all zones. That in turn lists the relevant standards, of which TR3, is it? Yes. Oh, 2 and 3 are part of that rule, and those standards in turn link to table TR7. So that causes your that links the applicability to all zones. But having said that, I listened to the discussion on clarity, and there's probably something there, but I think you can find your way. It might just be able to be clearer than it perhaps is.
Thank you.
No, that's a useful segue, sir, because one of the things that the submission talked about was an opposition to visitor car parking for residential development in the CCZ. Now that position is made, I think, clearer now, in that visitor car parking is only required if there's a short stay car park provided. Now, a typical apartment development wouldn't provide a short stay car park, so therefore the short stay bike parking isn't applicable. So our concern there falls away for residential development, correct? So, but in the event that an apartment development decided to provide a short stay car park for whatever reason, then a short stay bicycle parking requirement would apply, and I guess our position would be that for that sort of thing, the public realm's the place. But I just don't think it's an issue. We haven't pursued it.
Okay.
Coming back to I guess the balance of the centres, then we aren't pursuing that. Are not pursuing that. The issues may or may not be the same. Mr. Stewart might have a view around building costs in a metropolitan centre versus the CCZ, but I guess we leave that question in your hands. But we're not advancing that argument. It's not an area that Stratum is active in.
Let's be completely clear. I interpret what you're telling me is that you're not providing evidence or argument, but you're not amending the submission. But that
Correct.
Might be
correct.
Right.
Turning, I guess, to the general premise of the submission, a 1-to-1 ratio is not opposed in areas such as the residential zone. In fact, Stratum is already without the requirement of a standard providing bicycle parking in its developments to various ratios, admittedly, but more recently 1-to-1 on a couple of applications we've recently lodged. And the consideration is that a 1-to-1 ratio in the CCZ is inappropriate for the reasons specified in our evidence. The Stratum's preferred position remains that a 0 ratio is applied in the city centre zone. In other words, that the decision around bicycle parking is left to market dynamics. In the event that you do not accept that position, Mr. Clark's evidence is that a 1-to-4 ratio is a useful starting point. And I use the term starting point because I'll come back to the rule and policy framework a little bit later.
Mr. Lewandowski, have you've read the supplementary evidence of Mr. Wharton?
Yes, I have, and he's landed at 1.
Yes.
0.5 to 1. Sorry. Yes.
Yes.
And so, I mean, Mr. Clark and Mr. Stewart are probably better placed to discuss that, Commissioner McMahon. But we've applied the ratio with the associated design standard to a building that we have very recently lodged a resource consent for. And the net outcome of that is that the parking requirement to meet that bicycle parking requirement would occupy effectively the ground floor, and more than the ground floor of that building. And we put some costs to that. And so if we apply, this is somewhat crude, if we apply the ratio as recommended by Mr. Wharton, well, we're talking about half of the floor of a building. And I mean, that's somewhat crude, but and therefore you have the cost, but that's still a pretty substantial floor area and a pretty substantial number.
So we're talking about the same things, given my mathematical skills. When we're talking about ratios, you've just expressed it in terms of a 1-to-4 ratio, or 1 to, but the rule talks about 0.1 or 0.5, or so is the 1-to-4 that Mr. Clark refers to, is that a 0.25?
Yeah, same horse, different rider situation.
Yeah,
but yeah, very much.
And the 0.5 that Mr. Wharton recommended is a 1-to-2, presumably. Okay.
Yes, put the other way, it would be 1-to-2. Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Got it.
Correct.
Before you go on, Mr. Lewandowski, if you were listening to our discussion with Mr. Wharton, you will have heard the discussion about the possibility of the council providing additional traffic engineering advice from Ms. Fraser to say, well, where did the numbers in the plan come from? Because having read the Section 32 analysis, they're not in there.
Yes.
And I said, well, I think we need to go slow until we have the opportunity to talk to the Stratum team, because I don't want additional technical evidence popping out of the council case that Stratum has no opportunity to respond to. And there's also an issue about, well, should we be putting Stratum to that trouble, having played by the rules, to enable the council to patch up its position? Clearly, from the panel's point of view, we would be assisted by further clarification of where the council was coming from. But as I say, I'm very concerned to ensure that the process, if we decide to invite the council to provide us with that the process is fair to Stratum. So I throw that in the middle of the table.
Yes.
And invite your comments.
Yes, and I've only had a very brief chat with Mr. Stewart sort of around that topic generally. I think our position would be that we would not want to obstruct, I guess, your interrogation of the issues. So to that end, I think, very happy for that to occur. I don't think that in any way denigrates from the core argument that we are making, which is that whatever way the ratios have been arrived at, the cost considerations of those ratios have not been adequately considered. And so the fundamental case that Stratum is putting remains valid. My other comment, I think, Commissioner, would be that we would be keen to be able to comment on whatever Ms. Fraser might put before you, and I think that's probably particular to Mr. Clark, less so myself, but perhaps there might be a need for some supplementary work from myself, but certainly Mr. Clark would be keen to have him involved somehow.
Well, that's very helpful. I think that, and I'm now looking at Mr. Warden equally, what I have in mind is to, well, go back a step. Mr. Warden, I asked you to, if you could make contact with Ms. Fraser to see if she was available to provide material. What was the answer? Were you successful?
Mr. Anderson's been generous enough to make that contact, and
Delegated the task, yes.
given his connections with him, so yeah.
Yes, she has availability over the next.
Well, that's helpful for a start. I think what I have in mind, the panel has talked about what the questions are we would want her to ask. We don't want her ranging free over the entire set of issues. Like, we'll put this in writing, but in essence, we are looking for the technical underpinning for the ratios that are in table 7. Where did they come from? What's the technical justification for them? What I have in mind is, as I'm putting that in writing as a request for the council to supply that as a supplementary brief, and then providing Stratum with the, would 5 working days after receipt be enough? You're now volunteering Mr. Clark's time.
It should be depending on what.
Yeah, somewhat depends when it lands, Sir, I guess, regarding other commitments. So
Let's just say if I issued a minute on Monday asking for Ms. Fraser's input by that Friday, which is the so that's the 21st, and therefore a response from Stratum, presumably from Mr. Clark, but I wouldn't limit it to that. If there was a planning implication over the top, you'd have leave until the 28th. Is that doable?
The short answer to that question is yes. It just depends what's in that.
Well, yeah, well, let's keep it flexible. The deadlines are not fixed in stone. If the answer, if having reviewed Ms. Fraser's material, you think this is going to take more than you thought, then come back to us. But the target would be the 28th, and if that in turn causes stress on the council reply, well, we'll address that when we come to it, because I don't think that date is fixed in stone either. Although there are some things hanging off it that we would need to address. So let's proceed on that tentative basis. That I say I will document in a minute. Like, any feedback about the concept that we need to take into account?
Just a clarification would be helpful. Would you want that technical underpinning for the residential activities only of table 7, or all of table 7, including all the other commercial and community activities and tertiary?
Good question. I need to talk to my colleagues about that. I think my initial reaction is probably not, because we might, well, the Stratum position is they don't have a problem with the residential out in residential zones. They're only talking about residential in the centres in the submission, and their evidence is only talking about the CCZ. So my initial reaction that I need to confirm with colleagues would be it's residential in the centres only.
If the panel did decide to go much broader than that, it probably would be helpful for me to provide the scope available from submissions as to which standards are being challenged as well.
Well, the reason I said tentatively that is that I suspect there's no scope. That Stratum is the only providing the scope, but that might not be correct. It's certainly the only submitter providing evidence on the point. What do you think, Commissioner?
I'm primarily interested in the residential within the centres zones, but I also have an interest in Table 7A. And through the questioning of Mr. I can't recall his name, Mr. Liswin, he indicated he wasn't sure where the figures in Table 7A had been derived from.
Oh, 7A.
Yes, Commissioner, I responded to that at the saying that that was from myself, as drawn from primarily from the Christchurch district plan,
Right.
but also comparing against the Auckland plan as well, but determining that the Christchurch one was more appropriate for various reasons. And I'm happy to put that in detail for you if you like.
Okay, thank you.
So Fraser commentary by the 21st, Stratum response by the 28th, as I say, with leave to ask for more time if required, and we will detail exactly what we're asking for, but that's probably going to be limited to the residential in the centre zone. And we'll be talking about that over morning tea. So I'll give you an update of that after morning tea. What's it? Oh, we haven't got a morning tea break scheduled. Oh, well.
So if we do include 7A, I think there's probably a task for Mr. Lewandowski there, given Mr. Wharton's comments now.
Yes, okay, we'll think about that too.
Yep.
But I think it's slightly broadened into 7A.
I think our interest in 7A is negligible, so that's around on-site showers and lockers, which residential apartment buildings, which is our focus. We haven't talked about commercial buildings at all, so I think I could probably sit on the sidelines there quite happily.
Okay, so that's the plan. So with that, so carry on, Mr. Lewandowski.
Thank you. I'll just conscious of time. I'll try and move on. To note, there's no dispute around the higher level national regional direction around changes in mode share, cycling, micromobility generally. That's acknowledged. What I haven't been able to find, or what I do not see, is the direct line to be drawn from that higher level direction to a specificity of bicycle parking provision. And I think that needs to be applied contextually in order for those provisions to be effective and efficient. And the evidence here is that in the CCZ context, the costs there have very direct implications. And there's a distinction there again between residential, where the nature of that provision is quite different. It doesn't need to be within a built building necessarily in the sense of a commercial, a city centre building. It can be an outbuilding. It could be some sort of basic cover outside of a dwelling, etc. There are greater options there. And commercial development, of course, and that goes to the point I think made in evidence around the city centre as a destination. And you see that. I mean, I wrote in this morning. greater intensity of cyclists coming in the morning, and the need for facilities at end of trip is quite different to the amount of residential, if you like, ownership, which is unknown, and the CCZ as a point of origin, whether that's recreational or commuting trips. So you certainly see the flows into the CBD. They're evident simply by observation. It's much harder to get a grasp on the outflows, if you like.
So as a matter of interest, where are you biking from?
Island Bay, sir. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question, is Stratum concerned about the design and layout as well as these numbers? Because that has come up in passing, but your focus is on the numbers, but when Mr. Clark's talking about some of the issues in his evidence, it actually goes into design and layout. So that was another.
Before
area.
Mr. Clark might answer, I guess all we've done is taken the standard at face value and said, well, what does this mean? And translated that to a floor area.
I can ask Mr. Clark about that, but I just wondered generally if your submission was addressing that as well.
I think it is, Mitch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The figure 1 is a new element that wasn't submitted on because it wasn't there. Standard 3 simply specified a spatial dimension at that time. So, and we were concerned about that in a general sense.
It seems very linked and relevant to your submission, but I didn't really hear you just so far today talking about that yet.
Agreed.
Okay, but it might be something.
So picking up on that context, I don't consider that the costs of this have been appropriately addressed. And looking through the section 32, there is a sole paragraph on that issue, Commissioners, and that says simply, the PDP introduces new transportation requirements which will add development costs, such as provision for on-site micromobility facilities. So that is the extent of the cost analysis of these provisions. Picking up on a question on Tuesday, I've not been able to find in that 32 analysis, and I think this was picked up before, any assessment or consideration of those ratios. And I think there was an indication that might be there. I went looking again, and I don't believe it is.
Yes, well, I read it on Monday night too, and that was the conclusion I came to.
That's it from me for now. I just foreshadow, I want to come back to policy 3 and the rule structure. I've picked up on, I have addressed it in my evidence, that I'm just going to change my position there slightly, Commissioners, but I think before I do that, hand over to Mr. Clark and Mr. Stewart firstly, and Mr. Clark.
We'll hear from Mr. Stewart.
Okay, good morning, Commissioners, or I should say, Bola. I'm actually in Fiji. Hope that's not too upsetting with the cold in Wellington. Look, carrying on from our submission, look, I'm not going to go right through our submission. My overriding point is the economic effect this is going to have on future projects, and you just started to touch on that in the last few minutes. In our application, you'll see there's an addendum in there, I think, that's correct, isn't it, Mitch, that relates to Tory Street? That is there, Mitch, is it?
Yeah, so that's at the back of my evidence. There's attachment 1 contains the floor plate of the building currently applied for. That's the ground floor you're looking at there.
Yep. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Look, I always think that like a picture tells 1,000 words, and so this is a project on the corner of Tory and Vivian Street. You may remember it as the old Cricketers Arms. The real project, we own the site, we have lodged consent on it, and we anticipate taking it to the market next year. It's 135 apartments. I noted in Mr. Wharton's supplementary that he sort of skirted over it with a comment about, in effect, through this process, you or your other commissioners have accepted that there are now higher standards that have been effectively accepted by all of you than what the market wants to provide. I think that's a really lovely theory, But the reality is, the market is the market. I don't control it. Costs are costs. And if I use that building as an example, our estimated costs to build that is about 66 million. Typically, to bank a project of this type, the profit that we would need to show needs to be at least 20% before a bank will look at it. But the reality is, at the end of these projects, the margin ends up at sort of 10 to 15%. So if you assume that it is 15%, that then says we've got profit left of about $10 million. You will have seen an assessment that Gary Clark made, that the loss of revenue to provide a 1-for-1 ratio on that building would be in the vicinity of 7.6 million, because in effect, whilst we've shown you the ground floor, simplistically, we would lose a whole floor of apartments, which is would be 11 apartments. So at the end of the day, if we were designing and building under the proposed car parking requirement, the margin's down to 2.5 million. And like all of you know, that's not bankable, but that is the reality of what projects like this would look like. We're at last count, we've finished 22 apartment buildings in Wellington. I'd say that's more than anyone else ever. And we've got 3 schemes in our pipeline. We have all of these costs, we have all of this data at our fingertips. Look, typically in a normal market, we've got hundreds of clients that we've pre-sold to at any stage. And I don't actually ever recall being asked for bike parks by our clients. And we do talk to them all the time. And I think some of the surveys that we've provided really back that up. If you said to me, well, why is that? One of the things that we push in our marketing always is we live in a really really walkable city. And again, Mitch hinted at that in terms of where destinations start from. My role as a developer is primarily, and certainly in the next few years, is to provide affordable product and not to aspire to sort of this unsubstantiated higher standard as claimed by the council. And because the net result of that will be, we will just end up with unaffordable projects, and therefore they won't get built, and then our ongoing housing crisis continues. You might be aware, I was on the technical advisory panel for the MPSUD. Parking was debated at length during that process. And, look, the overriding conclusion was that the MPS had to enable density and free up the central cities with a minimum of restrictions. And, this, in my view, this proposed rule is actually more restrictive than the requirement to provide car parking. Interestingly, if Wellington City, there's been no central city car park requirement for many, many years, probably for as long as I've been active. Mitch mentioned earlier, we're not anti-bikes. In our suburban projects, some of our clients have expressed a desire for bike parking, particularly when we are close to some of the new networks. A good example is we've got an 85-unit project in Tawa next to the Countdown. So you've probably seen that from the motorway. We consented that 3.5 years ago, and in that scheme, we've got secure bike rooms that probably would cater for about 30 to 40 bikes. But the difference there is our cost to provide that is in the vicinity of 60 to 70,000, not nearly $7 million. And we've got 2 current projects, again, Mitch mentioned. We're designing bike parking into them because we can do it within their own private spaces. And again, they're in Strathmore and Northland, easily to connect into the city. So look, in summary, really we're requesting no bike parking in the central area or for residential. I feel very strongly that it will guarantee that there will be no further inner city buildings. I don't know how to design them and make them profitable on this basis. And as I said, I've done 22 buildings. And it will just be the end of future residential in the city. And I sort of see an irony in this, because the council and you and your fellow commissioners have actually done some really good work in the new districts plan. We've been in front of you or your colleagues a number of times, and yet I can see this one rule, if it's accepted in its current format, will actually undo everything. And I feel that strongly about it. So yeah, that's what I've got to say. And look, love to take questions once Gary's finished. Thank you.
Well, before we go there, Mr. Stewart, yes, I can confirm telling us that you're beaming in from Fiji is winding us up. I'm interested in you said you had the figures at your fingertips, and like between you and Mr. Clark, you've quantified the effect of these provisions. And tell me if this is a question for you or for Mr. Clark. What is the basis of the cost quantification? You've addressed it in a macro basis. Basically, it would sink the return, and therefore it wouldn't happen. But if you look at it a different way, what would be the incremental cost on the apartments that are left from this rule?
Well, using Tory Street as an example, for it to retain an end profit margin of 15%, the 6.8 million, I think it is, or approximately the figure we've said, we would have to add that to the divide that figure, and I don't have a calculator in front of me, and add that.
That's where Mr. Lewandowski comes in. He's just pulled the calculator on his laptop out. Give us the basis.
So Mitch, there's 100. That proposal is 135 units. I estimate we would lose a floor to provide car parking, which is 11 units. So divide our figure by 124 units, which is what would be left after we lost 11 apartments.
So am I dividing that 7.6 million by 124? Is that right?
124, correct.
Yeah. Sorry, Craig, just for clarification for the commissioners as well, is if you use the cycle design as and proposed, it's actually a floor and a third. Okay. Just to be clear.
Right. Well, that makes it even worse. Yeah. And just while he's doing that, commissioners, like, the costs on a building are significant, as you know, and very little of the interior fit out, walls and bathrooms and so on, are actually part of, contribute to that cost. The bulk of the cost is the underground, below ground cost, putting the structure up, designing it, all those sorts of things. You got a number there, Mitch?
120.
Yeah.
Okay, so
yeah, that number is, if you just took it as one floor lost, so 11 apartments, that's $61,300 additional per apartment. And if we took Mr. Clark's numbers of a bit over a floor, so 15 apartments, that becomes $63,300.
Okay, so I'll just commissioners, we've done a lot of work, 75% of what we do now is 1-bedroom apartments, which are typically between 45 to 50 square meters, and that's generally what a first home buyer can afford, and they're the people we've got to keep in the city. So we right now in the city, if 1-bedroom apartments and buildings were finished in the last few years are selling for as low as $550,000. For this building to be viable on the basis that I previously outlined, we need to be selling these at a selling rate of $13,100 a metre. So in round figures, depending on what floor, they would be selling for $620,000 to $640,000, which is where things were 2 years ago. from what Mitch has just told us, we would then need to be selling these apartments for over 700,000, which is just totally unaffordable for a first home buyer.
Just while the chair's still writing there, when your tower development and other multi-units that I've seen, it's you do one per unit. It's easy enough to do because it's just in their outdoor space or in a shed or something. In the Central City example, how do you land on the number that you're providing, say, in the Tory Street example?
Sorry, is that Jane? Is that Jane?
Yep.
I can't quite see it. Yeah. When you say the number, do you mean the number of apartments?
No, the number of bike parks that you're going to provide.
Oh, well, up until very recently, we just haven't provided bike parking. What we generally have done in most buildings is that we'll have 20, maybe 15 to 20 storage lockers that are available to purchase at between 10 to 15,000. And if someone often they would get used if someone had a bike. Interestingly, our most recent completion, which was 212 Willis Street, which we completed in September last year, I think we've still got unsold storage lockers there. We've also got unsold storage lockers just spread around the city in various other buildings. But I come back to my opening statement. We don't, in our perfect world, we don't want to be prescribed to have to provide a bike park, but we have covered it off in other areas, which is storage lockers, or as you'll see from the survey, those people that buy a car park sometimes will put a bike at the end of that.
So is it more driven by, this is the size of the basement, this is the basic services you need to squeeze in there, and the space you've got left, what you can fit in?
Yeah, often, yes, it is. Yeah, it is. Because another calculation that we use, so if you look at the GFA on any typical apartment building, like over the years, we've learnt the hard way that if our non-sellable space, by that I mean the common area, that the common area is the lifts, the stairs, if that ratio is more than 15% of the total building, then there is no profit in that building. And so, we're designing buildings now where we're getting that common area down to 12 and 13% just to try to make the things viable.
Right. And you work out the design and layout of the bike parks?
Well, we don't provide. We've never provided bike parking
per
specifically.
Se. But the Tory Street, the Tory Street one has a layout.
And what basically what we did is, like, at the end of the day, we have very strong relationships at council, and we never, like, we knew that we would be lodging this. Well, we were lodging it prior to any district plan changes, and in fact still are in relation to this item. But from our point of view, when we're going through the process and the urban design process, if we're showing a willingness to accept some change, it does make our route easier, and that you'll understand that, you've been on the other side. But also in that case, the bike parking that I think we can, is it about 20 units, Gary? I can't quite recall. They wouldn't comply to the standard as is predicted here. But the reality, but owners don't care about that stuff. They just, if they want somewhere to put their bike, and it's a small enough space that we could see a way to get some revenue out of it to at least cover some of that cost. And I haven't worked it through yet, but it'll be something like a license of maybe $1,000 a year. But it's not something, but it's a relatively small space that we could have sold as storage space. But I think if it met the standard, you might get 5 or 6 bikes in there. Would that be right, Gary?
Yeah, currently you've got 34, but it's 18 if you apply the standard.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Oh, that was what I read in the.
That's right. Yeah,
okay.
And we've sort of alluded to this a little bit, where I think, cut to the chase. What would be acceptable? Certainly not what it is now, because the answer is no. There'll be no new buildings. Leave it to us, within reason, like an acknowledgement that bike parking would be a nice to have. As a developer, we respond to the market, you know, and if our clients start asking us for it, we will find a way to provide some bike parking. And my point is, there will only ever be some clients that ask for it. Then we can find a way to respond to that. It's no different to the working from home scenario that's been very strong since COVID. In that same building, we've provided an area where we've got, I think, about 10 workstations so people can work from home. We can find a way to extract some revenue, not to make a profit, but just to kind of cover some of the costs. But my point is, we will find a way to respond. But there's no way in the world that 135 people all want to have a bike. I just look at where I live. I live in Glen Road in Kelvin. We're a central city. I'd be lucky to see a bike go down our street on any, you know, one day a week. And I've got 2 bikes in my garage, and they just sit there because, frankly, I'll get myself in trouble here now. I just find the network too dangerous to ride on. But anyway.
Okay,
Well, you can walk everywhere.
I think we should press
Thank
on.
you. Thanks.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you for
Yes.
that.
Any other questions from Mr. Stewart? Go for it.
Full of Vanaka, Mr. Stewart.
Voila.
Yeah. We'll see. You said that as a developer, you respond to the market, and I understand what you mean by that. And you also made it clear that up until recently, you just haven't been providing bicycle parks. Is the Tory Street an example of a more recent response by you as a developer to market demands in terms of the provision for bicycle parking? Why has that come about?
It's not a response to current market demands. It is very much a response, as I just alluded to show some provision for bike parking, to allow, when it's going through the urban design assessment at council, to sort of get a bit of a tick, even though it won't be a requirement under this application because of the timings of it. Yes. But if you were looking for a way forward, the size of what we've provided there, which we know we can put 36, I think it is, bikes into it, based on a smaller dimension. Yeah, we could live with that as a way forward.
Sure.
Bearing in mind all our other schemes that I have, I've got 2 other schemes in the city.
Sure.
With but the same sorts of numbers, 120, 130 units. We would find a way to provide that.
Sure. And you may not want to answer this, but have you pre-sold any of the Tory Street apartments? No.
No, I wish.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to sell anything in this country at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Have you done any market surveys though as to whether there might be a demand for bicycle parking for those 1-bedroom units?
Look,
what's your feedback? Yeah.
Not surveys in a formal way, but like as I said earlier, in a normal year, we have hundreds and hundreds of clients where we've pre-sold units to. They go through our office all the time. When we launch projects, we build big display suites. I go there for the first 3 or 4 weekends myself, just to listen to what people are saying. Yeah. And we respond then. We either make changes very quickly within that project, or we respond on the next one. I'm very, very hands-on. Some of you will know that. And so I can't produce a formal survey, but what I can tell you, in all of my experience, I've never been asked for a bike park. Okay. Yet, in our Tawa project, when we said, look, we are providing a few bike parks, for 2/3 of the people would shrug their shoulders and go, oh yeah, whatever. But some people went, oh, great, because in that site they can cycle down the hill and along the back roads to Jayville and then join into the inner city networks from there. But even in a residential area, which is going back to Mitch biking in from Island Bay, there was very, very few people that were overly enthusiastic about it. But we we give us the ability to respond as our clients ask for it, rather than make it totally prescriptive.
Okay.
And then there'll be no buildings.
Yes.
Hope that answers it, sort of.
It does, and it's a question also for Mr. Lewandowski too. We're dealing with a planning period of 10 to 20 years here, where preferences and demands might change. So, but what you're saying is the way that you'd prefer to deal with that is through flexibility and letting the market decide, and you respond accordingly. That's the message I'm getting from you.
Yes, totally. And I'll just give you another example. Car parking is a great example. Remembering we even notwithstanding the MPS UD, we didn't have a requirement for car parking for many years in the city. We still provided them, but then the market told us that they didn't want them, or they couldn't afford them. So we still have buildings that we built. Republic is one of them, which is the brick building opposite Moore Wilson's. I think I still own 20 car parks in there 13 or 14 years after that was built. I still own storage lockers over a range of buildings in the city, which are basically bike parks.
Okay.
Still own them. They're available we regularly send out to the databases. These are available. No one wants them.
Okay, just one further question. I have some experience with inner city apartment living and car parking and bike parking and storage lockers. So I was very interested in your responses to Mr. Black's questions about how does this all work. Couple of things there. Do you, as a developer, do you place restrictions on the ability of owners or tenants to bring bikes into the apartment or store them on the balcony?
Yeah, no, totally. No. So we like, as you'll know, there's the standard unit title rules, body corporate rules.
Yes.
Typically on any project we do, and this would be the case for years, we would have something like 6 to 7 pages of addendums. Yeah. And they cover all the different things that we've learned over the years. For example, no bikes on decks. And I think if you drove around the city now, you will see that pretty rarely, whereas there was a period where you did see that.
Yes.
And basically we have a rule for everything. No bikes and lifts, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But there'll be early projects that don't have those.
Yes. Do you accept that there'll be more onus on those sort of rules if there's a lack of specific provision for bike parking within apartment complexes?
Well,
because I'm thinking particularly of the situation last year where an e-bike exploded in an apartment and caused some.
Already the insurers have actually come out with edicts that relate to that, and it's very difficult to get in insurance at the moment on any inner city building, and the insurers they've already jumped on that. So but look, that's a good point. Going forward, we will no doubt add a rule that talks about e-bike charging, but we know that most of these body corporates on these big buildings are professionally run. They're not just run by the owners.
Understood.
But,
just a couple of very brief questions. Are the storage lockers generally big enough to take a bicycle?
Yeah, typically. They will typically be approximately 2 to 3 meters long, 2 to 3 meters long by 1.5 wide.
Yes. Are they usually on their own? Sorry, are they usually on their own title?
Yes. Yeah, always on their own title. Yeah.
So they're a tradable commodity.
They're always a principal unit. They're not an accessory unit.
Yeah. And would most car parks be big enough to house a bicycle also?
Totally. Yeah.
What about an e-bike?
Yeah, they just sit at the end, or a lot of them are always on a wall, and there's very good rack systems out there. But look, I think these utopian standards. I've got 2 e-bikes. They just lean against the wall in my garage, which is where most of us that live in houses. That's how we treat them.
Well, maybe in a few years, Mr. Stewart, when you're not able to visit Fiji as regularly and get the health benefits, maybe the e-bike will be something that you might ascribe to.
Possibly. It might be in a wheelchair by then, unfortunately.
Well, or a micro-mobility device.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's all from me.
I think we should proceed, team. Mr. Clark, I think we've thrashed these she's around. Is there anything you want to add before we ask you some questions?
I understand I need to be brief. Look, I think just a couple of key points. You've obviously read my evidence. The origination or origin of the one space per unit appears to come from other district plans. It's just been adopted and transferred in. And this is something that also happened with visitor car parking, with the original district plan with one space per 4 visitor car parks. That requirement on visitor car parking disappeared pretty quick out of the district plan because it was unworkable. And there was no foundation, no evidence-based approach in terms of that ratio. And it's my conclusion in reading the stuff that I can find is that there is no evidence-based approach in terms of this ratio for cycle parking versus apartments, particularly apartments. And I'd be interested to see some. So in light of that not being available, we've gone out and done some surveys. It's only a snapshot, admittedly, but that came up with some numbers which you've seen obviously in my evidence. The key thing about the city centre is it's the origin for people who are working in the city. So the need for people to commute via a bicycle is somewhat redundant because they'll walk or use public transport. And that is Wellington. Wellington is a very walkable city. And the suggestion that you need a bicycle to commute to employment at the rate of one space per unit seems a little bit unrealistic. Just on the cycle park design, I haven't gone into that in detail, but there is only one problem when you prescribe something to the level of detail that you do have in the proposed district plan, is if you want to do something different, it becomes a debate that you end up having with engineers on the other side of the fence in terms of council. So I suppose my only comment to that is if you can water down, or it's a guide rather than a standard, because we don't know in 5 years' time what innovations might come through with cycle design and cycle accommodation, for want of another word. Even in the last 3-4 years, we're now seeing double stacked cycles that you've got on Wellington sidewalks. Happy to answer any questions.
Not a question, but a request. In fact, I only have 2 points. The request is, can you give us a table? You've described in text the results of your informal survey. Can you give us a table, address, number of units, number of bikes?
Yes.
So we've got to end the ratio. Like obviously we could calculate the ratio ourselves, but if you,
I've done it in a spreadsheet, so
if
that's
you've got it
available
on a spreadsheet,
Yep.
if effectively, and as an appendix to your evidence, to set out in tabular form the information you've given us in words.
Yes.
And the second, and if you could do that, please, in the next few days.
Oh, I can do that very quickly, yes.
Okay, so if I would say to you by, because I'm interested, having talked tentatively about the timeline for Ms. Fraser, I'm interested to get that on the record before Ms. Fraser gives us her material. So close of Monday, is that too soon?
I can give it to Mitch by the end of today.
Okay.
It's just a matter of putting a spreadsheet into the format.
No, all right, we'll say
Monday will be fine.
Yeah.
so close of Monday. And the other question is, you've talked to us about the dynamic of the central city. As you say, that it's more recreational users than commuters if they have bikes. What's your view on the likely spatial variation across the city? We have the intrepid cyclists from Island Bay, and I was discussing this the other day. I can imagine there might be quite a high high usage coming out of Newtown. We've got presentation shortly from the Johnsonville Community Association suggesting that commuter bikers are few and far between out of Johnsonville. So what's your view about likely spatial, if it's, well, you've made a strong case on that one-to-one is inappropriate at the central city. Is it appropriate anywhere else?
That's a excuse me, a really good question. As I've lived in Wellington and various suburbs of Wellington, including Island Bay, Miramar, Johnsonville and Thorndon, I did cycle to work from Island Bay and Miramar and Johnsonville. Those were the days where there weren't e-bikes. It wasn't overly pleasant or enjoyable experience sometimes. E-bikes have changed that. It's been a game changer, to be honest, for a lot of cities where the hills are no longer the obstruction that it used to be, and also the notorious Wellington Northerly. Spatially, you've really got good facilities from Miramar, Kilburnie, Lower Bay now that are at grade. Island Bay is always a challenge because of the, if you like, missing link in terms of off-road paths, if you like, or clear of the moving traffic lane. And Johnsonville is a challenge because of the narrow gorge, but it's still available. But I would suggest that it's probably, in terms of ease, it's more towards the eastern and southern suburbs than the north, excluding Crawley's actually quite bikeable. I live there as well. Crawley's quite bikeable because the grades aren't too bad apart from Glenmore Street. But I suppose it's become more bikeable, but it's more towards the east and south, I would have said. But that's an opinion, obviously.
Thank you. Commissioner McMahon?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Clark. Just one question from me about the survey, and it's not a criticism at all. You said it's just your own words. It was a snapshot at a point in time. How representative do you think it is of the situation with central city apartments?
Yeah, it's.
I mean, Mr. Stewart's one of the main providers. I acknowledge that.
Yeah, it was done in response to just having some information, because of the lack of information. I did similar surveys around traffic generation from apartments with regards to cars, because there was no information. It had a very wide range, which demonstrates that it is only a snapshot. One aspect that I did take some comfort from was the one that did actually have some cycle storage facility that wasn't in front of a car park or in a common space, was only about 90% full. So that suggested to me that if there was a demand there, then that would be full and there'd be bikes overflown into some other parts. Yeah. And that ratio of that 1 to 3.5 was on that particular site, interestingly enough, as well. But it is limited, but it is at least something.
Yeah. Okay. You're not aware of any other surveys that have been taken by other providers?
No, and I think that's where my issue was with this one per unit. There just wasn't any justification for that.
Okay, thank you. That's all from me.
Commissioner Black?
No, thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you in anticipation of your further contributions. Mr. Lewandowski.
Thank you, sir. I'm very conscious you've got people waiting, but I just want to very quickly cover one other aspect, if I may, and I will be as fleeting as I can be.
And please proceed.
Because I think it's important, sir. Where a situation arises where you do not comply with these ratios, you're into a restricted discretionary activity under Rule TR1. Now, there was a question, and I think answer from Mr. Anderson the other day in respect to the ratios, and where he put to you that, well, in a city centre context, you enter a restricted discretionary resource consent in any case, and therefore it's it could be appropriate to consider a non-compliance as part of that. I think he's correct, obviously, that you are into that situation. you are in that situation creating an additional non-compliance rather than sort of just considering it as part of the existing trigger. And the matters of discretion take you to policy P3. Now, in my evidence, I've said that I'm comfortable with the objective, and that remains the case. But on further reflection, I'm not comfortable with P3. And I think that is not just particular to the city centre, but I think universally, because I might ask Mr. Clark to hand you something out, and this is just an attempt not to land on a perfect solution, but to highlight for you where the issues are and what a potential approach might be here.
Presumably your focus here is on subclause 4 of P3.
Well, I would start first higher up, Commissioner McMahon, and that is only allow.
Okay.
So only allow creates a reasonably high hurdle. And then when you read only allow with number 4 as it was, you would only allow where projected demand for cycling and micromobility will be lower than that required in the standard. Now, I don't know how we get through the projected demand question, because what I think Mr. Stewart was covering off before is we consent a building, Mr. Stewart takes it to market. We don't know who the purchasers of that building might be as we're consenting it. So that's a primary hurdle. Now, I've tried to there express the nature of change I'd like to see here, and I acknowledge Mr. Wharton might have some views because I'm unpicking that policy that applies it more broadly than the cycling and micromobility parking aspect that I'm focused in on. But I'm hoping that highlights for you the nature of the issue I'm identifying and what the nature of change might be. I don't suggest it's a perfect resolution, but it's a starting point in any case.
When you talk about purchases, can I assume that, like Mr. Stewart's talked about, his apartments being aimed at first home buyers who are presumably maybe in their late 20s or 30s, fit as the proverbial buckrat and ready to ride? I assume that if your target market is the greying generation, of whom I am one, that the ratio might be rather different.
Yeah. So my underlying point is even if you have a ratio, with citywide, whatever that ratio might be in any given situation, there needs to be a consenting pathway for where that ratio might not be complied with for whatever reason, whether it's a design limitation, a cost limitation, or a cost implication that affects the viability. You need a consenting pathway, and that consenting pathway relative to policy P3 would appear to me to be pretty narrow at the moment and a reasonably high hurdle of only allow. And so I'm trying to identify those issues for you, and I've had a crack at how that might be resolved, acknowledging that it isn't necessarily the perfect resolution as I put it to you this morning.
Mr. McMahon, any?
Yeah, yes. What's the derivation of proposed clause 5? Is it something you've produced, or have you leaned on other?
Oh, sorry, sir. No, that is my own construction. Reasonably hurriedly last night, I must admit.
Okay. Okay.
So I've tried to move it away from the projected demand, and I've tried to bring in a question of adequacy to inform the discretion, and then also remove the only allow to allow.
Yep. Yeah, you accept that still puts an onus on the applicant to address demand and supply in terms of the adequacy question in the context of the location and the development. So there still needs to be an evaluation undertaken.
It does, and so it's not perfect, but I think the
Yeah.
movement from only allowed to allow
Yeah.
provides some greater flexibility there, sir.
Yeah,
Um,
and the wording, it does not impact on its economic viability.
Yeah,
What's,
it being the project, sir, again,
Yeah.
I appreciate the
Yeah.
wording's not perfect.
okay, so it's work on. Okay, apart from that, I just have one question of clarification, and you said much earlier that in relation to figure 1, that was something that wasn't part of the notified plan, and therefore you had no submission on it.
Correct.
Mr. Clark's indicated that if figure 1 is to be abided by, then it would change the provision from 30 something to 18, I think, is along those lines.
Yeah, so he's taken the Tory Street example as
Yeah.
it was prepared, and he
Yeah.
said, well, if I put that standard to it, what does it mean? Yes.
Yes. And Mr. Clark suggested that if it is to be retained, it should be more of a guideline rather than a standard. So where does that leave Stratum on the position of figure 1? So it's not part of your submission, but that's because it didn't exist at the time the plan was notified.
Well,
So
that,
what do we make of that?
I think that speaks again to what I'm suggesting around P3, because if there's a non-compliance with that, then that needs a suitable pathway to be assessed against our standards, not meeting
Yes.
standards.
But the difference between figure 1 and table 7 is that table 7 existed
Yes.
and figure 1 didn't
So I
at the time of notification.
is the question, do we have scope to address that?
I want to know what, I mean, this applies to 7A also about the showers and lockers, and I don't know whether Mr. Stewart is aware of that requirement and whether that is just another hurdle that he might have a concern with. So you batted it away at saying that you weren't concerned with 7A.
Well, 7A certainly. I mean,
Requires that creates another requirement for space in an apartment, perhaps not to the same extent as a bike park might.
Commercial.
the table 7A would not have any implications for an apartment building. It would be purely around commercial development.
Okay.
I think, Commissioner.
So
but in
Is
terms
that
of the,
so? If that's the position of Strata, I'll record that.
yes, but in terms of the figure, I think we have commented on that in terms of our general concerns around the space implications and therefore the cost implications. And I guess what I'm saying now is that if you were to provide a space that didn't meet that standard, then that consenting pathway needs to be appropriate.
Okay.
That the general concept of a guideline, well, of a design standard, isn't necessarily opposed. It might even be useful. But,
Okay. So in synopsis, the options that you're putting in front of us are preferred position, no standard, no figure. If there is to be a standard, reduced ratio with a nuanced policy as a matter of discretion.
correct.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you.
Just if I can just quickly jump in again, referring to Tory Street. Yeah, we've designed a bike park that's got 36 car parks in it. Sorry, 36 bike parks. But if we have to follow the standard, we only get 18. And sorry, that was all I had.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I think that we should call it a day at that point. As the old saying goes, you'll be hearing from me. We'll look forward to Mr. Clark's table and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you. Enjoy your holiday, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you. I will. Home tomorrow, unfortunately.
We're waiting for JCA. We'll just take a brief break before we go on. Yes. Yeah. Yes. We'll just take a brief break before we get underway, Mr. Taylor. We'll resume. Thank you. The representatives of the JCA, Mr. Taylor, Ms. Therese, welcome once again. We have your presentation, so I don't want you to read it to us. But over to you. We have 20 minutes to devote to you, your case, and so if there anything particular you want to highlight, then please do that.
We will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I think the main things that we want to focus on is this problematic transport hierarchy, and then we'll talk about the infrastructure issues, including a lack of a town centre plan and the need to include additional infrastructure. So starting off with the problematic transport hierarchy for planning the development of the city. This hierarchy has the heroic assumption that we'll either walk or cycle or take a scooter from Johnsonville to Wellington City and similarly return on a daily basis. And we've outlined in our submission that walking to the city and back is basically delusional urban planning. It ignores the fact that residents value their time. It takes a long time to walk into the city. And we also made the point that walking not only to Wellington but also to Porirua or the Hutt Valley is really not a practical proposition. We've also commented on cycling and the Nauranga Gorge factors that make that a very unattractive proposition for Johnsonville residents. And it's very clear to us that very few residents, and including even other people, are attracted to using that gorge. In terms of scooters, I've never seen anyone use a scooter on that gorge. In summary then, the number of residents either walking, cycling or scootering from Johnsonville to city and returning is non-existent to very low. And this reinforces the key point we want to make, that we want high quality public transport as the only viable alternative to car travel. It makes it imperative that Johnsonville's public transport system is top-notch to meet residents' commuting needs as well as contributing to reducing the city's CO2 emissions. We've also noted in our report the assumed priority of walking, cycling and scooters for travel by persons with significant disabilities not even mentioned or highlighted. And we've made further commentary about that. And it sort of almost leads us to the conclusion that the urban planning, particularly in this space, is becoming extremely exclusionary to anyone who doesn't sort of fit the sort of profile that the council officers would like to be using these forms of transport. Moving on, Johnsonville's population is going to be densified. I know the commissioners are aware of that. There's a 60% increase in population over the next 30 years. And it's also clear from the NPSUD that densified communities were to be supported where they have railway lines by rapid transit services to justify the densification. We all know now that the council, including Minister Bishop, have incorrectly classified the Johnsonville rail line as a rapid transit service, despite the Commission ruling that it is not. The Commission knows the assessment by the council and the Minister is not correct because of the very strong counterfactual evidence given to it by a range of independent transport experts, including Wakatoa. What is really concerning about this situation is that there are no plans from the council, nor Wakatoa, nor GWRC, either in the next 10 years or 30 years, to upgrade the Johnsonville rail line. In his report, Dr. Helm, there's a report for Stream 1, Dr. Helm warned the council that if densification proceeded without a significant upgrade to the Johnsonville rail line to address residents' commuting needs, there would be a significant increase in congestion on the northern motorway coming into Wellington. This would obviously also increase CO2 emissions for the city. This leaves Johnsonville with a massive problem. It doesn't have a rapid transit service to meet the commuting needs of its residents as densification is implemented in Johnsonville. This is a problem that just simply cannot be brushed aside. It has to be dealt with. It is supremely ironic to us that the Wellington Council wants to densify Johnsonville, but the transport chapter doesn't even have a single chapter in it about a rapid transit bus and train service to address the commuting needs of Johnsonville Metropolitan Centre residents. It's almost as though they expect us to walk, cycle, or take a scooter to address our commuting needs. It's just simply totally unsatisfactory. Accordingly, the JCA requests the support of the Commission that a rapid transit service rapid transit bus service be developed for the Johnsonville Metropolitan Centre residents, both current and future, travelling to and from Wellington. And we've outlined a number of recommendations there. Do I need to repeat those?
No, you don't.
No,
What I was going to say to you is you're occupying a lot of time and you're not leaving us with any time to ask you any questions.
That's fine. I'll move on. I'll move on to infrastructure now. In its presentation to the Commission for the wrap-up stream for the ISSP, the JCA gave a very long list of projects on pages 5 and 6 of its presentation. We particularly made the point that all infrastructure shortfalls need to be identified and fully rectified before densification was implemented. Not only is this best practice, it is consistent also with the overarching requirement from the NPSUD that the densification of communities results in well-functioning urban environments. And in this regard, we just want to comment on the two issues. The updated town centre plan issue. Johnsonville's town centre plan was last updated in 2008. Since that time, urban planning developments since then, and the densification intended for Johnsonville makes it very clear that the town centre plan should be updated to reflect how Johnsonville as a metropolitan centre will be planned. Currently, there's a complete void in this area, which cannot possibly represent best practice. And we've set out recommendations there, including, the infrastructure chapter in the council's district plan needs to include a new section titled Updating Town Centre Plans for Metropolitan Centres. I won't comment further on the recommendations there. In terms of the additional infrastructure issue, the key thing to note here is the PDP is a restricted definition of infrastructure consistent with Section 2 of the Resource Management Act, but it isn't consistent with the NPS UD, which introduced the term additional infrastructure. And that term of additional infrastructure is intended to provide social infrastructure related to education facilities, healthcare facilities, open spaces, and I've left one out, which I haven't got in front of me. And it's clear that the NPSUD intended that social infrastructure should be in place for densified communities. Otherwise, why would it have been included in that policy? And I've got to say that JCA's experience with the council through the district plan hearings has shown us that getting social infrastructure and local public transport infrastructure in place so that Johnsonville is ready for densification, to us, seems to be largely irrelevant to the council. JCA saw this firsthand during the JCA's wrap-up presentation for ISSP, where we basically got negative responses to everything, notwithstanding the fact that, as you pointed out in Report 1A, that some of those matters are, were ultra-virus. we think it's absolutely vital to include additional infrastructure in the definition of infrastructure in INF 01. And the reason for this is that we want to make certain that infrastructure for, particularly for densified communities like Johnsonville, is fully integrated. And if you have all of the, what we would call sub-chapters, that would include public transport, could include education, open and green spaces, then under an infrastructure umbrella, it makes it clear to planners that you must provide for all of these requirements and must do so in a fully integrated manner. And just to finish off, Mr. Chairman, just a couple of typos. Page 5 of our submission, first paragraph, page 5, delete the last sentence. Accordingly, the JCA recommends as follows. And on page 9, sorry, page 9. Page 9, 12A, at the end, as defined in the NPS UD, not US. Thank you for hearing us.
Thank you. Can I just, by way of clarification, you picked up a fact that the Section 42A report includes in your section on walkable catchments, you picked up a fact that the Section 42A report has some material about the definition of a walkable catchment.
Yes.
Can I just point out that Mr. Wharton was quoting from regional council materials, that is what is in change 1 to the regional policy statement. It's not what's in the district plan, but if the regional council confirms it, the council will be legally obliged to give effect to it. So it's a different process, which is proceeding in parallel, and we'll know shortly what the hearing panel's recommendations on the regional policy statement are.
Okay.
So that's not a question, it's something for you to be aware of. The other point I want to make is that you've made a lot of recommendations that at first blush to me are outside the jurisdiction of the district plan. So for instance, the extent to which public transport is provided is a matter that council has an interest in. It's primarily a regional council issue, but it's also a set of issues that are addressed under different legislation. The district plan provides a framework within which that can occur, but it can't require that it happens. And so the question is, how can the district plan facilitate this? If you accept my premise that it can't require it, how can the district plan be framed in a way that allows it to happen as opposed to requiring it?
Well, land needs to be set aside for provision of an integrated covered bus hub. The land also, provision needs to be made for land to be acquired to double track the railway line. And so in the plan, there needs to be something that makes future provision and sets aside resources to be used for those needs as and when the relevant authorities decide to proceed with them. And so the district plan has to protect the future infrastructure needs for the area. And I don't know quite how you do that, but perhaps you can encourage when permits are given that there is provision for when Stride for example, decides to develop the mall, there could be some incentives given to them or provision of something so that that was a good commercial decision for them to make provision for a combined bus and train hub as part of the redevelopment. And also similar provisions could be made for other developers when they were developing large complexes, that they make provision for suitable public transport stops to be available, and covered provision for bus routes through and other areas like that, perhaps.
That's helpful. Thank you, Ms. Rose. Commissioner McMahon, did you have any questions?
Me, thank you.
Well, as a food for thought, as I emphasised that we're grappling with the extent to which the district plan can address the issues and it may be that where we land is that we can encourage the council to think about these issues, but we can't actually find a useful amendment to the plan, but you can rely on the fact we'll be giving it some thought.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Yes. Yes, we do appreciate your efforts and thank you for pointing that out. It's difficult to know exactly where the boundaries of everything lie.
Oh yes, we're still working that out. So thank you very much, both of you. So the next submitter is Firstgas Ltd, coming in virtually. So we've got, my note says Ms. Wallace and Ms. Unkovich. So I have Ms. Unkovich on the screen in front of me. So would you care to introduce yourselves and take us through your presentation?
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. I am assuming that you have both our further submissions and presentation evidence in front of you, so we'll not be speaking to those. Generally, we don't have contention with what was provided within the Section 42A planning report. There was some clarification sought within that report in regards to the separation of residential activities from sensitive activities, and I have provided that within our evidence, but I'm more than happy to speak to that and expand that out should the panel require that. I also have a couple of inconsequential points in terms of editing, and our legal representative Lauren Wallace will also speak to a definitions clause that I did not include within my evidence that unfortunately we seek to have retained as per our submission, so she'll follow me through with that. But overall, as provided within our original submission, we do seek that any district plans provide sufficient recognition and protection for gas pipelines and the networks that traverse the district. Our key thing is the requirements that we have under higher order regulations and our operating codes to consider risks to people and properties and communities, and to mediate those risks wherever we can. We have found that relying on pure property rights and easements does not always provide us with sufficient oversight. So this is why we're seeking to roll out much the same as Transpower has with the national grid. We're seeking to have a similar kind of consideration for the gas transmission networks that are throughout the North Islands. We seek, and again, we work pragmatically while we seek a corridor setback. This does not mean that we look to prevent all development happening within that space. We're merely wanting to make sure there is a trigger that councils are able to enact to require our input or require consideration being given on development that's in proximity to the transmission network.
Thank
And
you.
that's, yeah.
Thank
So,
you, Ms. Unkovich. I wonder if we should hear from Ms. Wallace and get the any the additional matter she's going to address, and then I'll ask my colleagues if they have any questions.
Thank you, Sir. Tēnā koutou katoa. I just have one brief matter to speak to. As the Section 42A report has largely accepted Firstgas's submission, so it's understood that the submission points are not in contention, but obviously if there are any questions, happy to answer those. The one point that wasn't addressed was in relation to the submission to seek new definitions to be included into the district plan. There were 3 definitions that Firstgas proposed, being the gas transmission pipeline corridor, gas transmission network and gas transmission pipeline. The position of the 42A reporting planner is to accept the submission to map the pipeline corridor, and that this would negate the need for the network to be defined as well. So my submission is that a definition is still necessary and does add certainty and provide clarity for plan users. In terms of being able to map a corridor, it doesn't necessarily provide the degree of certainty that a definition can. So, and in addition to that, the components of the gas network, despite its national and regional significance, are not necessarily commonly understood. So by that, for example, I mean the network includes associated above and below ground fittings, appurtenances, fixtures and other equipment that are sometimes assumed not to be part of it. The gas transmission pipeline is often considered to just be the pipeline in the ground. So it's important that there is clarity on that, and when you are looking at a planning map, you can see the 2 lines, but it's not necessarily clear what the distance is and how you would measure it. So it's therefore submitted and recommended that the definitions that Firstgas sought should be included in the plan, and it's noted as well that this is the practice in other district plans, including the New Plymouth district plan where I'm sitting at the moment. So that was the only matter I wanted to address you on. I'm happy to take any questions.
Ms. Wallace, I think my recollection is that the reporting officer has suggested to us that rather than a definition, that the relevant provisions make clear that when it refers to the network, it is as mapped. Does that get you maybe not all of the way to where you want to be, but substantially?
It does get us a long way there, sir. Just speaking from experience and using other e-plans, however, we've had situations where, depending on what scale you're at, it can be difficult to ascertain where the corridor stops and starts. And so having a definition, so for instance, the definition in New Plymouth is the area of land within 20 metres of the centre line of the pipeline. And that just provides that certainty around when you're on the ground around how to actually measure it.
Another point, if I can just raise too, is that there are times when we need to realign or reposition pipelines because of emergency events, for instance, or other occurrences, and the process to get the district plans remapped to show that can sometimes take longer. So having a definition that really identifies the distance from the centre line of a pipeline can assist in those terms, those situations.
Okay. Commissioner McMahon, any other questions from you?
No, I'm familiar with the situation in New Plymouth with the definition and mapping that occurs there.
Yes, I suspected you would be.
Good, David.
Mr. Black? No, I think that we understand where you're coming from on that point and more generally. So we'll see what the reporting officers have to say in response in their reply. So thank you very much, ladies, both.
Sorry, to the panel, can I just add one small thing to my evidence point 20, which refers to INF P7 reverse sensitivity. There was a consequential amendment where, in terms of amending the gas transmission pipeline to use the gas transmission network, point number 2 of INF P7 does have a similar need for that editing to be done, which doesn't appear to have been done in the online plan, and I can't see any reference to that in the Section 42A report. So I will obviously take it on advice if that amendment has been made in that specific point, and it's just a consequential, very small edit, if that's possible.
Well, I think we'll rely on Mr. Anderson to report back whether that's a glitch, and if not, whether he's on the case. But I'm sure he's noted that down. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
We'll sign off there. Thank you. Thank you both. We have Ms. Whitney and your colleague. So how would you like to proceed?
Thank you. So my name is Pauline Whitney. I'm a planner at Bottomless School here for Transpower, just for the record, and I'm joined by Sarah Shand, environmental planner at Transpower. So I have provided just some very brief speaking. I'll send them through electronically as well. But there's just kind of 4 points of clarification, so I thought it might be helpful if you have them in front of you,
right,
that you can annotate as we go. So I will be very brief in terms of our initial presentation, and then obviously welcome any questions.
Well, you could, as you know, Ms. Whitney, you can rely on it.
I can. I welcome them. So for completeness, my experience and expertise outlined in my evidence. So unfortunately, I haven't had the benefit of listening to the panel questioning of the reporting officer. So bear with me if I'm a bit behind the 8 ball, but I have read all the supplementary evidence from Mr. Anderson. So there now appears a large degree of alignment between the evidence of myself and Mr. Anderson. So, and I'm conscious for the panel that there's probably various variations floating around. So if I can just confirm that other than the 4 matters, which I'll briefly go over, I support the changes as shown in the annotated appendices dated 30th of May that Mr. Anderson provided. So that might be the kind of guiding document to go off.
That was the attachment to the supplementary evidence.
Correct, yeah. And it's got the rebuttal amendments 30th of May
yes,
up on the corner.
Yes.
So, yeah, I'm happy to refer to that rather than the versions in my evidence and things. So then maybe if agreeable, I'll just run through the 4 matters. 2 of them are just minor corrections and 1 is just clarification, and then there's one about mapping. So are you happy for me to go through those?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first one is just a minor point. The National Grid Infrastructure Chapter, it's policy 63, which is now renumbered as policy 62.
Yep.
So that's development of the national grid. So under clause 4, Yeah. So under clause 4, Mr. Anderson had deletion of the words the operation, maintenance, upgrade, major upgrade or development of, and I think it's just an error that the development of should be retained. So, and that aligns with what was sought in my evidence. So that's just a minor point. Thank you. The next one is in, again, in that infrastructure National Grid chapter, the standard S18, which is conveniently the only standard on the last page. There is the or between the first and second clause needs to be deleted. Previously, as it was notified, those clauses 1 or 2 related to the same issues, so it wasn't or, but now they're different ones, so that can be deleted. And also, I think just to reflect the approach with another standards in the plan, it would be helpful to include an and after clause 2 to make sure that all 3 clauses have to be met.
Gotcha.
There was a bit of variation I found in the plan, but that is the most consistent approach to have the and at the second to last clause. So those are just minor points. The third point then relates to INF National Grid Policy 61. So again, the same chapter, and this is the renumbered policy 60. Yes, adverse effects on the national grid. I just note some changes have been made through Mr. Anderson's supplementary to that clause 2, but the wording in the body of his supplementary evidence in paragraph 125 outlines no changes are proposed.
And this is the point where you take issue with Mr. Lindenberg at KO.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Correct.
Yes, that is an error that's been hangover from when I was fiddling around with the wording, weighing up both Ms. Whitney's and Mr. Lindenberg's submission points. What is in the 42A, in the supplementary rather, is what I have landed on. No changes.
So the appendix is wrong, the text is correct.
Yeah, so these are just minor points I thought it would be beneficial to clarify at this stage for the panel. And then the last point is obviously the mapping, which I anticipate some questions on. So in terms of the mapping of the National Grid Yard and National Grid Subdivision Corridor. Otherwise, yeah, comfortable with everything, and yeah, appreciate the efforts of Mr. Anderson and acknowledging the submission and evidence. Thank you.
By way of introduction, I should tell you that when Mr. Anderson presented, because you haven't had this, I had a number of questions for him about it, what I perceived to be areas where his suggested text, the National Grid, did not align with the NPSET. And putting it politely, he ran for cover and said he'd relied on you.
Okay. Thank you.
And so I think I need to ask you the same questions, and so you can explain to me the logic, since the underpinning of this came from Transpower submission.
Certainly. So if you can, yeah.
So I start with objective 7, that the national significance and benefits of the grid are recognised. Fine, and the national grid is protected and provided for. And I was read the NPSET, which talks about the effects on the grid are managed. So there is a significant ramping up in this objective compared to the NPSET. So the question is, where has that come from?
think it's also I guess the genesis really of that is policy 10 and 11 of the NPSET. And also there's probably two parts, maybe if we break it into that. And so the first part is the national significance and benefits are recognised. Sorry, so do you have an issue with that particular clause?
I'm not telling you that I've got issues.
I know,
I've just
but
got questions.
Would you like to explore in two parts?
No, don't worry about it.
Okay, so we'll just go on to the second part, which is the national grid is protected and provided for.
Yep.
So I guess the primary policies of that are 10 and 11, which contain quite directive wording about avoiding reverse sensitivity and ensuring the operation, maintenance, so forth, of the network is not compromised.
You'll forgive me for correcting you. That in relation to reverse sensitivity, it's to the extent
reasonably possible, correct?
To the extent reasonably possible.
Yes, which is as well through the plan you can achieve that through provisions. So it's possible to achieve that protection through provisions in the plan.
I suppose if we would take that attitude, why did the NPSET have that qualification at all? If it would always be possible to write provisions that provided absolute security.
Yeah. Well, also this is obviously for decision makers, so it would have been, maybe be potentially as well before there were provisions in a plan. So decision makers would need to give effect to the policies within the NPSET at a consented stage for third-party activity. I guess we have some comfort now that given the time the NPSET has been around and the majority of plans have provisions included, but certainly in the early days that was not the case.
Okay.
And I guess the provided for is provided in policy 2 as well of the NPSET, which essentially provides must recognise and provide for the electricity transmission network. And the protection of the network is one way to provide for that network in terms of ensuring its ongoing operation and ongoing operation. It's not compromised. So I guess my understanding is all the policies of the NPS work together. And so it is a general objective. The other approach would be to have a lot of specific objectives, but I don't think that would be efficient or effective.
Okay. Understand your point. The going on to P58, recognise and provide for benefits by enabling the operation, maintenance and upgrade. Again, NPS policy 5 qualifies that by saying enable reasonable operation, maintenance and minor upgrade. So, and again, there is an obvious difference between what the NPS is saying and what that policy is saying.
Correct, but policy 2 as well is also very directive. Decision makers must recognise and provide for the effective operation, maintenance, upgrading and development of the ET network.
Which is a different thing from saying it must enable. The term of art, in effect, enable equals a permitted activity rule in this plan, and provide for indicates probably an RDA.
Well, obviously, for existing assets, the activity status is determined by the NESETA, the NES electricity transmission.
Yes, and I understand your point. The P60, I wondered if that was just duplicating P58. What additional what is that providing that is additional to P58?
So is that the P60 that's recommended to be deleted by the?
I was looking at 48A and maybe that Mr.
Yes, in the supplementary evidence, Mr. Anderson.
So that's already
That's correct.
gone.
that was a
That's
good
been removed
clarification.
for
That's
that very
addressed there.
reason.
Thank you. The in relation to upgrades, the P62, there's no reference to the provisions in policy or the qualifications in policy 7 directing avoidance of town centres and minimising urban amenity effects, and do they need to go into that policy?
My only pause there is obviously within the Wellington context, you have a number of lines within existing urban areas.
Well, exactly.
Exactly. So I mean,
but that, like I can visualise. I can visualise a house in Wilton with a Transpower line over the top of it.
yeah, agree. So I guess my query is, if you put that in there as a strong policy directive, how would you avoid for an upgrade where you maybe just move in the line next, within proximity? How would you then avoid that residential area when you're in it at the moment? Because if it was...
No, it says avoid town centres.
Town centres.
I'm not aware that there's a Transpower line anywhere within Kui of a town.
How's town centres defined in the plan? I'm not clear. Would that capture... No, it wouldn't capture any existing. So therefore, there's no existing assets within those town centres. So it would be captured by development, I would have thought.
Yes, but it's the minimise urban amenity effects that I'm particularly interested. Should that be in that?
I think it would have to be qualified given the existing assets. I mean, that is planning and development. So to my mind, policy 7 really relates to new transmission assets as opposed to existing. And you'd have to then give careful consideration to the other policies, such as policy 2.
Well, yeah, like this, it's development of the transmission system, which must surely include upgrades.
Correct, but I don't think it is also development. It's planning and development
Of the transmission.
Of the transmission, yeah. So I guess it's also covered by policy 6, substantial upgrades of transmission should be used as an opportunity to reduce. So if anything, policy 6 would be an appropriate qualifier within that policy as opposed to policy 7.
I suppose the issue I have is, you say it would need to be qualified, but of course that's what the NPS directs, and you are rightly strong on the need, staunch, I might even say, on the need to apply the NPSET faithfully and not to water it down.
Yep.
But does that cut both ways? And to the extent that the NPSET provides protection for the rest of the community, you shouldn't be watering that down either.
Correct. No, I completely understand that point. I guess it has to be contextual as well. And so I certainly see an argument for including policy 6 within there, but certainly I'd have concerns about policy 7.
Okay.
And that is to some degree addressed under clause 5 of that policy, where appropriate major upgrades should be used as an opportunity to reduce existing adverse effects.
Yes.
So that could be made more directive.
Say something like on the end, including through minimising adverse effects on urban amenity. But to an extent, urban amenity, well, in the example of Wilton, which I'm most familiar with, where the line goes over the top, well, those lines are part of the existing urban amenity. It's not it might be nice for the residents of the locality if those effects were reduced, but the NPSET doesn't require that. It's more incremental effects, adverse effects that it's targeting.
And clause 5 relates to adverse effects, so that would include amenity effects.
Well, yeah, that could be. Okay. And the point I raised about policy urban is it's captured in relation to development of the national grid on policy 63, but it says should avoid material adverse effects. Now I can imagine why you would be concerned about material adverse effects, but that qualifier material is not in the NPSET policy.
Correct. No, I do accept that. I guess the point is that I wouldn't want that policy to avoid all adverse effects. There'd be no degree then of the nature of the effects. And remembering that new development could be it could be an underground line or something like that. So
like so you'd want some qualification of.
I think so. I mean, otherwise having all adverse effects is very wide, particularly given the avoid directive and the topography of Wellington that where at the moment you do the lines come into Oshiranga Bay, and then to get north, it's highly likely you would need to go through an urban area.
The other another question I had related to Rule 60 said making all upgrading of existing national grid infrastructure within the coastal environment outside of basically high natural character areas is permitted. And the question for you is, in view of those policies we've just been talking about, should that also be outside urbanised areas?
Well, of course, if I can just qualify in terms of those policies 59, 60 and 61, so they would only apply for new assets that are then works done at a future date, because the activity status for all the existing assets is covered by the NCETA.
Oh, absolutely. So, well, and even if it wasn't, that they have existing use rights.
They do. So I don't actually anticipate those rules being applied anywhere in the near future. So I hadn't turned my mind to that.
Okay.
So this would be within the coastal environment.
Like we're in our we've discussed with the reporting officers and Stream 6 is that the coastal environment covers a lot of the city, and but interestingly, probably thinking about where your lines go, probably not the parts of the city that are because it's obviously there.
Yeah, there, correct. Yeah, it's only Oshiranga Bay.
Whereas the grid lines are all all coming from the cable. In the western suburbs where they cross and into the substations up on the western suburbs. So that's probably not an issue.
Yeah,
in practice.
Yeah, from my recollection of looking at the maps, it's only around about Otaringa Bay, macro kind of area, where they're within the coastal environment.
The turning to your evidence. Take you to footnote 3.
Sorry, on page
10.
10.
Can you tell me what the words that are supposed to be there
Oh, sorry.
should say?
So, it'll be noting earthworks within the National Grid yard are addressed in the earthworks chapter, I presume. So they were addressed at an earlier hearing. I'll just find what paragraph is that? Oh, it's in paragraph 7.3. Yeah. Yes, so that's third-party earthworks, sorry, within the National Grid yard of other parties. So the rules for subdivision and earthworks are addressed in those respective chapters.
So the missing words are at the earthworks chapter.
Yeah. I mean, obviously in Transpower submission, it did seek that they all be brought into one area, but I'm comfortable with the approach. It's where it's landed.
In terms of mapping.
Yes.
The question, and just had a discussion with the Firstgas team on the parallel issue that they have. The discussion we had with the reporting officer was along the lines of that if they're mapped, if the corridor is mapped, then any search by address will pull it up. And in the situation where a line might not be on the subject property, but the corridor is, that in terms of practical enforcement and implementation, it's much better if the E-plan facility draws people's attention to the existence of that corridor, which you'd say is not the preferred approach, but the question is, would a Transpower in fact be better off, more likely to achieve its objectives if more people were aware of the existence of that corridor?
So I see this as an emerging issue, and as plans have got better, it may be more easily resolved. To date, there have been issues where it hasn't been correctly mapped, and as Firstgas pointed out, a plan change was Hamilton Plan Change 6, which was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, was solely kind of based on mapping. We've corrections to the how the National Grid yard was mapped. As planning maps get better, I think there's probably less room for error. But I guess I still have some concerns with the technology and how it's provided. I was thinking whether there'd be benefit of having, and obviously now a lot of plans as well are having it where it brings up the various layers when you click on your property. So that's getting better and better all the time as well.
Like that's the facility I'm thinking of, that people plug in their property and it tells them that the National Grid yard is across their property. But that only occurs if the corridor is mapped.
Yeah, I guess my concern is having people solely relying on the mapping and then not talking to Transpower and ground truthing it, particularly within Wellington, the urban areas, the topography where it's quite hilly and things like that. So I guess Transpower's preference is always that people come talk to them. And Transpower, Ms. Shand made comment, Transpower will easily go out there and ground truth it in effect to provide a definitive answer.
So, yeah, we have a dedicated online portal system where any landowner or developer can upload an inquiry if they know they've got a transmission line either on their property or in very close proximity. They can provide us a high-level concept plan. We've got a team of engineers and planners that will review that for them. It's a free service. We'll provide advice on the safety of their design and its compatibility around the national grid.
Okay. Moving on to.
Oh, maybe can I just provide one more comment?
Yeah.
I did have a thought I was thinking about this morning, and I wonder if you could have a ghost overlay, which brought up the alert, and then people would then still have to refer to the definition to highlight to them that actually you do need to actually, you can't necessarily rely on the map. So they'd click on their, if they were within a ghost 12 metres, they'd click on their property and it would come up, you know, as a note. It's likely you're in the National Grid yard or National Grid subdivision corridor. Please refer to the definitions.
I'm just thinking. There is a parallel provision that might repay Mr. Anderson's study in relation to the root zones of notable trees that are indicatively mapped. Where I seem to recall that we recommended some provision along the lines of the map shows you may be affected. Apply the definition to confirm the exact boundary. So as I say, Mr. Anderson is diligently writing that down, and we will no doubt study that as a possible precedent.
I certainly see merit in that approach. I just as a quality, if I can again, just but I certainly support retention of the definitions within the plan.
Well, moving to the definitions, National Grid subdivision corridor. I think number A, 14 metres of a 110 kV transmission line on single poles or cable. How is a transmission line on a cable?
Well, transmission lines includes a cable?
Well, it's not on the cable.
So maybe if we did 14 metres of a 110 kV transmission line, maybe comma, on single poles, comma, or a cable. Because it's really the 110 kV, which is the key bit.
It's so a cable might be underground. That's the point.
Yeah, correct. A cable is, in terms of the terminology Transpower uses, as an underground asset.
But it's not on. On is the wrong word.
It's not.
I'm not sure what the right word is. Maybe you could tell me.
Well, maybe we put some commas on there. So you differentiated on that applies to single poles, and then you had. Well, you could have 14 metres of a 110 kV transmission line.
Or a 110 kV transmission cable, or line
on single poles,
or a line on single poles, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Next, G, 350 kV transmission lines. Are there any of those?
So was that?
Is this?
There is. That's our HVDC
Oh,
network line.
so it's that's the short stretch from where it comes ashore.
That's right. So that's the HVDC line we have. It actually starts down in Benmore in the South Island, comes up, goes under the sea. We've got undersea cables that come up at Otaronga Bay.
Yeah, I've done a site visit there.
Oh, great. I've yet to get there. And then from there it pops up overground again and heads up to Haywards.
So there is a 3K.
Yeah.
The National Grid Yard C, the option up to 110 kV or greater. What does that add? Because it seems to be saying at any voltage.
Correct. We could remove that to simplify it.
The suggestion I was going to make was, rather than say that's up to 110 kV or greater, is to say other than B.
Or we could just say either or we could just finish the sentence.
Well, because B is an example of a line on towers and PI poles, but it's got 10 metres. So this is everything else.
Correct. And B, because actually it's a strange line, it's got no voltage. It's an earth wire, isn't that one as well?
Well, that's right. But so it seemed to me that B is a special case, C is the default.
Correct. Correct.
So if you said other than B, that would make it, because otherwise they're going to conflict. Your suggestion in page 21 of a revision of P39. So it's P59. Hey, no, that's right. So, oh yes, the expansion, talking over the page 22 to 23, adding reference to technical requirements. I asked Mr. Anderson what technical requirements would not give rise to an operational need. And he said, well, you'd better ask Ms. Whitney.
Okay, and this is a good question. Previously, when I read operational need as defined in the National Planning Standards and adopted in the PDP, I thought it encompassed everything. I'll just read it out for the benefit. It means the need for a proposal or activity to traverse, locate or operate in a particular environment, those are some keywords, because of technical, logistical or operational characteristics or constraints. So I thought that covers technical and so forth. And then I started looking at the word particular environment and I thought, well, does that consideration confine operational need to that a locational context? So you need to go there. I guess I'm being quite
it's-
pedantic.
So the point you're making is that it's not just that you need to be there, it's how you need to be there.
Yeah, and your issue for operating and maintaining may not necessarily be the location because you're already there. It's whether you need to put a new bit of equipment on and things like that. So I guess just for belts and braces, I thought technical requirements kind of covered that other element.
So the paragraph 732 talking about the effect of a non-complying activity status. And I suppose my reaction was that you're focusing on consistency with the NPSET.
Mm-hmm.
Also, had to, in the specific example you're talking about of like a new cable,
Mm-hmm.
you're also talking about the CPS. And Port Otago tells us that where you have conflicting NPS provisions, you need a structured analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Once you've decided that there's a conflict, you need a structured analysis. I'm not sure what that is, but I'm not sure that what you provided us would qualify either. And so it's that juxtaposition between where the NPSET comes into conflict with the avoid policies of the CPS and how they are reconciled. So can you give us some more commentary on that?
Certainly. If I just refresh my memory. So this relates to it was rule 57. Oh, so read number 48, thank you. Yeah, so it was the old rule. Okay, new national grid, let's say, within outstanding natural features and outstanding landscapes within the coastal environment. Yep, so non-compliant. So that's been transposed over into the national grid chapter. And in the Transpower submission, it sought discretionary activity status, which I supported in my evidence.
And Mr. Anderson agrees with you.
Mr. Anderson.
Which is a good start. But as I say, I'm querying that in the coastal environment, how are the conflicting directions at national level directions appropriately reconciled? Like, obviously, you would say the correct end result is where Mr. Anderson's led.
Yeah.
But what's the analysis that gets you to that conclusion?
I guess the policies now numbered 61 and 62 for upgrading and development of the national grid provide that analysis. Particularly, obviously, 61's not relevant because there's no assets in the coastal environment that aren't designated. So it's 62, which is the key one, which is new development within the coastal environment. And that provides kind of in clause 3 really about it kind of marries NZCPS and ET in terms of what you should do, seek to avoid really mitigate, that there may be it's there. Yeah, and clause E, recognising there's some areas where avoidance is required. So I guess that is I would see it as the structured analysis that reconciles those two national direction.
Okay, thank you. And And then the discussion about Rule 58 and S18. And the point I'm interested in is obstructions to Transpower's access to the grid.
Mhm.
You and I have had this discussion
Have.
before.
We have.
So we'll just take the point of principle as a given.
Yes. Yeah.
But I am interested in S18. Your suggested wording too must ensure vehicular access to national grid support structures. So does that mean if Transpower doesn't currently have vehicular access, then anyone doing anything in the grid has to ensure that is provided?
That is a good point. And I'd just like to note, I am comfortable with the wording provided in Mr. Anderson's supplementary, which has vehicle access to any national grid support structure must be provided.
Well, I would say that it's the same problem.
Same thing, yeah.
That saying it must be provided assumes it's already provided.
Yeah, as I understand, we can certainly get back to the panel and confirm that. I know within other districts, this has come up within Central Hawke's Bay, and it was confirmed that all the existing structures have access at the moment. So we could certainly get back to the panel on that, and if not, provide some qualifier about it relates to existing.
Well, I was going to suggest that you turn it around and just say not preclude.
Not. So how would that, sorry, and
not preclude.
Not preclude. Yeah, and that would, yeah. I mean, certainly we don't see this as requiring access where it isn't. It's just ensuring either you maintain the existing access, or if you block the existing access, you provide another access.
As if you turn it around and say not preclude.
Not preclude, I'd be comfortable with that.
And so that's all I had. Commissioner McMahon.
The short answer is no, so I don't have anything else.
And the same for me too, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Blake?
No, I was just interested in the mapping question and the hybrid in relation to that. Yeah.
Well, that would seem to be that.
And I think if we did have a hybrid, I think Transpower, if I can speak on their behalf, would probably welcome an opportunity to look at those mapping layers before they are.
I'm sure that in the informal channel that exists between yourself and Mr. Anderson, you can sort that out.
We can certainly work together. Thank you.
So thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
And fortunately for us, that's it for the day. And we'll be back adjourned until 9 AM tomorrow. I look forward to seeing you. So won't see you on designated